Hello and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight we're drifting off into the history of Lent and Shrove Tuesday, understanding what Lent means, how it came to be a significant symbol in Christianity, and how pancakes got involved and became Shrove Tuesday. Let's dive in. Long before the smell of pancakes filled kitchens on a Tuesday in late winter, before church bells rang out the beginning of a solemn season, there was a different world, one where the rhythm of the year was marked not by calendars on walls, but by the turning of the earth and the ancient human need to prepare, to purify, to make ready. Our story begins not in one place, but in many. In the earliest days of the Christian church, scattered across the Roman Empire in small communities of believers, there was no Lent as we know it today. No 40 days, no ashes, no pancakes. But there was something else, something older and perhaps more fundamental, the understanding that important moments in life require preparation. In those first centuries, when Christianity was still young and often persecuted, the most sacred day of the year was Easter. The celebration of Christ's resurrection was the beating heart of Christian faith. And even then, people understood that such a momentous celebration deserved more than simply showing up on the day. Those preparing for baptism, new converts who would be welcomed into the church at the Easter Vigil, underwent intensive preparation. This wasn't a casual commitment. These early Christians were fasting, praying, and learning, sometimes for weeks, in preparation for the moment they would be immersed in water and emerge as new members of the faith. By the 3rd century, this period of preparation had begun to take shape. In Rome, new Christians prepared for 3 weeks. In other places, it might be 40 hours, echoing the time Christ spent in the tomb. But there was something powerful about the number 40 that kept appearing in the Christian imagination. 40 days and 40 nights of rain in Noah's flood. 40 years the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. 40 days Moses spent on Mount Sinai. And most significantly, 40 days Jesus spent fasting in the desert, tempted by Satan, before beginning his ministry. It was in the 4th century, after Christianity had emerged from the shadows of persecution and into the light of imperial acceptance, that Lent began to crystallize into something recognizable. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD made references to a 40-day fast, though the exact practices varied wildly from place to place. In Jerusalem, Christians fasted for 8 weeks, but only on weekdays. In Rome, they counted differently, eventually settling on 6 weeks before Easter, which gave them 36 days of fasting if you didn't count Sundays, when fasting was forbidden because every Sunday was a little Easter, a celebration of the resurrection. But here's where the mathematics of devotion becomes interesting. 36 days wasn't quite 40. So in the 7th century, Pope Gregory the Great made an adjustment. He moved the beginning of Lent to a Wednesday that would become known as Ash Wednesday. Now, counting from that Wednesday to Easter, excluding Sundays, you arrived at exactly 40 days. The sacred number had been achieved. During these centuries, Lent was not the gentle, symbolic observance it would later become for many. It was rigorous, demanding, often harsh. Christians abstained not just from meat, but from all animal products, eggs, milk, cheese, butter. They ate 1 meal a day. In the evening, they gave up entertainment, avoided celebrations, refrained from marital relations. Lent was a time of stripping away, of intentional discomfort, of remembering that life was more than pleasure and comfort. But human nature being what it is, when you know a period of deprivation is coming, you prepare. You fortify yourself. You say goodbye to the things you'll be giving up. And this is where our story takes a delicious turn. The night before Lent began, that Tuesday evening before Ash Wednesday, became a threshold moment. People needed to use up the foods that would be forbidden: the eggs, the milk, the butter, the fat. In England, this day became known as Shrove Tuesday, from the word shrive, meaning to confess one's sins and receive absolution. People would go to confession, be shriven of their sins, their souls made clean before the penitential season began. But Shrove Tuesday was also deeply practical. Households looked at their stores of rich foods and asked themselves, what do we do with all these eggs, all this butter, all this milk? The answer, arrived at independently in kitchens across Europe, was brilliantly simple. You mix them together. You make pancakes. In France, they called this day Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, a name that would travel across the ocean and transform into something entirely different in the New World. In Germany, it was Fastnacht. In Poland, Tłusty Czwartek, Fat Thursday, celebrated a few days earlier. But the impulse was the same. Before the fast, there must be a feast. Before the emptying, there must be a filling. Before the solemnity, there must be joy. And so, as winter began its slow retreat and spring waited in the wings, communities gathered. They made their pancakes, their donuts, their rich pastries. They ate, they laughed, they prepared their hearts for what was coming. They stood on the threshold between abundance and abstinence, between celebration and contemplation, between the ordinary time that had passed and the sacred season that was about to begin. This was the ancient pattern, the rhythm that would shape centuries. Preparation requires preparation. The holy requires the ordinary. The feast and the fast are two sides of the same coin, each giving meaning to the other. And in the simple act of making pancakes from the eggs and butter that would otherwise spoil, our ancestors created something profound, a bridge between the secular and the sacred, between the practical and the spiritual, between the kitchen and the cathedral. Our story has only just begun. As we move deeper into history, into the heart of the Middle Ages, Lent becomes something more than a season of fasting. It becomes a lens through which we can see an entire civilization struggle with desire, discipline, and the nature of being human. Imagine a medieval European town in the weeks before Lent. The winter has been long and dark. Food stores are running low. This is the hungry time of year when last autumn's harvest is diminishing and spring's new growth hasn't yet arrived. But there's an energy in the air, a kind of frenzied anticipation, because everyone knows what's coming. Not just Lent's 40 days of restriction, but the glorious, chaotic celebration that must come first. In these medieval communities, the days leading up to Lent, particularly the final week, known as Shrovetide, transformed into something that would shock many modern Christians. These weren't quiet, contemplative days of preparation. They were explosive, carnivalesque, sometimes violent festivals that turned the ordinary world upside down. The word carnival itself tells us something important. It comes from the Latin carnivale, farewell to meat. But this farewell was no gentle goodbye. In towns across Europe, Shrovetide became a time when normal rules seemed suspended. Young men organized into gangs played brutal football matches through the streets. Not the organized sport we know today, but wild melees involving entire villages with goals that might be miles apart. Windows were shuttered, doors were barred, and the ball might be a pig's bladder stuffed with dried peas. People were injured. Sometimes people died. But it was tradition, and tradition was sacred in its own way. In parts of France and Germany, communities staged elaborate battles between personified figures, Carnival and Lent. Carnival was depicted as a fat man, jolly and red-faced, riding a wine barrel, wielding a spit of roasted meats. Lent was a thin, severe woman, pale and drawn, sitting on a simple chair, armed with fish and vegetables. They would fight in the town square, and everyone knew that Lent must win, but Carnival would make her work for it. These pageants were more than entertainment. They were theology made visible, the eternal struggle between indulgence and discipline, body and soul, earth and heaven, played out in costume and song. But why this intensity? Why did the approach of Lent create such fervor? To understand this, we need to understand what medieval Lent actually meant. This was not a symbolic fast with occasional small sacrifices. For 40 days, Christians were forbidden to eat meat, eggs, dairy, and often fish as well, depending on local interpretation. They ate one meal a day, taken in the evening. Married couples abstained from sexual relations. Entertainment was forbidden. No music, no dancing, no games. Wedding celebrations ceased entirely. You could marry during Lent, but there would be no feast, no party. The whole texture of daily life changed. The church's reasoning was clear and uncompromising. The body, with its appetites and desires, was a source of temptation that drew the soul away from God. Lent was a time to master the body, to deny its demands, to remember that humans were spiritual beings trapped in flesh that would one day return to dust. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return, the priest would say on Ash Wednesday, marking foreheads with ash. Medieval people took this seriously, far more seriously than we often do today. But here's what makes medieval Lent so fascinating. The very intensity of its restrictions revealed how impossible the church's ideal actually was. People were not angels. They could not fully transcend their physical nature. And so Shrovetide became, in a sense, a sanctioned rebellion, a moment when the church acknowledged human weakness by permitting, even encouraging, excess before demanding abstinence. The pancakes that gave Shrove Tuesday its culinary identity served multiple purposes in this world. Yes, they used up forbidden foods, but they were also deeply symbolic. In an age when most people worked brutally hard physical labor and calories were not abundant, those rich, butter-laden pancakes were fuel for the body before the lean times. Some historians estimate that people in medieval Europe might lose significant weight during Lent, not from healthy mindful eating, but from genuine scarcity combined with religious restriction. Different regions developed their own Shrove Tuesday traditions, each reflecting local culture and concerns. In England, pancake races emerged, women running through the streets flipping pancakes in pans, a tradition supposedly beginning in 1445 when a woman in Olney, Buckinghamshire, was so absorbed in making pancakes that she forgot the time and ran to church still carrying her pan when the shriving bell rang. Whether the story is true or not, it captures something essential: the collision between the sacred and the domestic, the kitchen and the church, always meeting at Lent's threshold. In parts of Eastern Europe, Shrovetide included mock funerals for herrings or other symbols of Lent's meager diet. People would parade through streets carrying a herring on a stick, singing satirical songs, before burying it or burning it in effigy. The ritual was half mockery, half anxiety, laughing at what you fear, making light of what you cannot change. The church authorities watched these celebrations with mixed feelings. On one hand, they understood that human nature needed release valves. Let people have their wild days now, and they'll be more compliant during Lent. On the other hand, things sometimes went too far. Church records from the medieval period are full of bishops complaining about the excesses of Shrovetide, the drinking, the fighting, the sexual license, the mockery of sacred things. There was a particular tradition that troubled the clergy: the Feast of Fools, celebrated in some places during Shrovetide. Lower clergy and lay people would take over church services, elect a boy bishop or bishop of fools, wear masks and costumes, sing obscene parodies of hymns, and generally make carnival of the very place meant to be most solemn. Some scholars see this as a necessary social safety valve. Allowing the low to mock the high once a year made the hierarchy more bearable the other 364 days. Others see it as evidence of genuine religious skepticism bubbling beneath medieval piety's surface. But perhaps the most telling aspect of medieval Shrovetide was what it revealed about the human relationship with food, pleasure, and guilt. These weren't separate spheres. The feast made the fast meaningful. The fast made the feast precious. Sin and redemption, indulgence and penance. They created each other, defined each other, needed each other. As night fell on Shrove Tuesday and the bells rang for Ash Wednesday's dawn, something shifted in these medieval towns. The streets, so recently filled with chaos and noise, grew quiet. People who had been wild and loose the night before now filed solemnly into church, heads bowed, ready to receive the mark of ash on their foreheads. The transformation was complete, the threshold crossed. And in that crossing, in that annual rhythm of explosion and restraint, medieval Christianity revealed its deepest understanding of human nature. We are creatures caught between earth and heaven, body and soul, appetite and spirit. Lent and Shrovetide weren't opposites, fighting for supremacy. They were partners in a dance that acknowledged the full complexity of being human. The pancakes had been eaten. The carnival was over. The long, lean days stretched ahead. But the memory of butter and eggs and laughter would sustain them through the darkness. And the promise of Easter's resurrection would pull them forward, through the wilderness, toward light. The 16th century arrived like a thunderclap across Europe, and with it came voices that would challenge everything, including Lent, including Shrove Tuesday, including the very rhythm that had governed Christian life for more than 1,000 years. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517. And though that document said nothing directly about pancakes or fasting, it set in motion a transformation that would reshape how millions of people understood their relationship with God, with the church, and with their own bodies and appetites. The Protestant Reformation didn't begin as a fight about Lent, but Lent became one of its most visible battlegrounds. To understand why, we need to understand what the Reformers saw when they looked at medieval Christianity's elaborate seasonal rhythms. They saw, or claimed to see, a system of works righteousness, the idea that humans could earn God's favor through their own efforts, their own sacrifices, their own denial. Luther's core insight, the doctrine that would split Christianity in two, was that salvation came through faith alone, by grace alone, not through any human work or achievement. You couldn't fast your way to heaven. You couldn't pray your way there. You couldn't give up meat and dairy and somehow purchase God's approval. Christ had done the work. Humans simply had to believe. If this was true, and Luther and the other reformers were convinced it was, then what did that make Lent? What did it make the elaborate system of fasts and feasts, of permitted and forbidden foods, of penitential seasons carefully calculated and observed? The answer, for many Protestants, was troubling. Lent began to look like superstition, like Pharisaical rule-following, like the very kind of external religiosity that Jesus himself had condemned. Some reformers went further, seeing in Lent's food restrictions not just useless tradition, but actual harm, a denial of God's good gifts, an implicit suggestion that some of God's creation was inherently impure. In Zurich, the reformer Huldrych Zwingli made his break with Catholic practice explicit and dramatic. During Lent in 1522, He and several companions publicly ate sausages, deliberately violating the fast. It was a theological statement made in meat. We are free in Christ, and no human law about food can bind a Christian conscience. The act was shocking, scandalous, and very deliberate. Zwingli was arrested, but the message had been sent. The old order was crumbling. Across the Protestant world, Lent's status became uncertain, contested, variable. Some Protestant churches retained Lent, but stripped it of its mandatory character. It became a season for voluntary spiritual reflection rather than required fasting. Others rejected it entirely as a Catholic corruption. The Church of England, in its characteristically English way of trying to find a middle path, kept Lent in its calendar but relaxed the rules, making them more about spiritual discipline than rigid food restrictions. And what happened to Shrove Tuesday in this new Protestant world? The answer varied dramatically depending on where you were. In staunchly Protestant regions of Switzerland and parts of Germany, the entire carnival tradition was suppressed. Reformers saw in Shrovetide's excesses not a harmless release valve, but evidence of the Catholic Church's moral bankruptcy. They encouraged sin before Lent, the Protestants argued, in order to keep people dependent on the Church's system of confession and penance. Better to eliminate the whole corrupt cycle. But culture is stubborn, and traditions that have fed communities for centuries don't disappear just because theology changes. In England, Shrove Tuesday persisted, but began to change character. Without the severe Lenten fast to follow it, Shrove Tuesday lost some of its frenzied edge. It became more domestic, more focused on the household rather than the town square. The tradition of making pancakes remained, partly because it was practical, partly because it was delicious, partly because it was what your grandmother had done and her grandmother before her. In fact, something interesting happened to pancakes in Protestant England. Freed from their specific theological context, using up forbidden foods before the fast, they became more purely festive, more focused on community and family. Pancake recipes became more elaborate, more varied. Some included ale or wine. Regional variations emerged. The act of making and sharing pancakes on Shrove Tuesday became less about preparing for deprivation and more about celebration for its own sake. Meanwhile, in Catholic regions that rejected the Reformation, Shrovetide and Lent continued largely as before, but now with an added edge of defiance. In parts of Italy, Spain, and Catholic Germany, Carnival became not just a celebration, but a statement of identity. We are Catholic. The elaborate processions and mass balls seem to say, we keep the old ways. We honor the rhythms our ancestors honored. The Council of Trent, the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation, met between 1545 and 1563 and reaffirmed Lent's importance. The bishops gathered there insisted that fasting and other penitential practices were not attempts to earn salvation, but appropriate responses to God's grace. They tightened some rules, clarified others, and made clear that Lent would remain central to Catholic practice. Shrove Tuesday, by extension, retained its place as the threshold. But even within Catholicism, subtle changes were occurring. The medieval world assumption that everyone shared the same religious calendar, the same rhythm of fasts and feasts, was breaking down. Now, there were Protestant neighbors who didn't observe Lent at all, or observed it differently. The simple fact of religious pluralism, even when that pluralism was hostile and sometimes violent, changed how people experienced these traditions. What had been universal now became particular, denominational, a marker of which side you were on in Europe's religious wars. These wars, devastating conflicts that ravaged Europe for more than a century, were fought over many things: political power, territorial control, economic interests. But they were also genuinely fought over questions like, what does it mean to be a Christian? What practices are essential? What is tradition and what is corruption? And in the background of these grand theological battles, ordinary people continued to make their pancakes, or didn't, to fast during Lent, or didn't, navigating a world where certainties that had seemed eternal were suddenly up for debate. There's a poignant record from an English household in the 1550s, during the tumultuous period when England swung back and forth between Protestantism and Catholicism, depending on who was on the throne. The household account book carefully notes expenses for Shrove Tuesday pancakes some years, and their absence in others, tracking the religious temperature of the nation in flour and eggs. The Reformation also inadvertently set in motion a longer process of secularization, the gradual separation of cultural traditions from their religious origins. When Protestants rejected or modified Lent, they didn't intend to create secular carnival celebrations, but that's partly what happened. Freed from their explicitly religious framework, Shrovetide traditions began a slow evolution toward becoming simply cultural festivals, celebrations of community and season rather than theological statements. This process would take centuries to fully unfold, but we can see its beginnings in the 16th and 17th centuries. In some Protestant towns, Shrove Tuesday became focused on charity, not penance before God, but compassion for neighbors. Pancake races and football matches continued, but increasingly as community entertainment rather than religious ritual. Meanwhile, in the parts of Europe where colonization was beginning to be a major force, Spain and Portugal especially, but also Catholic France, Shrovetide traditions were being packed up and shipped across oceans. Spanish conquistadors brought Carnival to Latin America. French settlers carried Mardi Gras to the Caribbean and eventually to Louisiana. These traditions would take root in new soil, merge with indigenous and African cultures, and eventually create celebrations that would far outstrip their European origins in scale and spectacle. But that story was still gestating. In Europe itself, in the aftermath of the Reformation, Lent and Shrove Tuesday existed in a new state of fragmentation and contestation. What had been the unified rhythm of medieval Christendom was now multiple rhythms, competing rhythms, each claiming authenticity, each reflecting different visions of what it meant to follow Christ. The pancakes remained, though, in Catholic kitchens and Protestant ones, in households that observed strict Lenten fasts and those that didn't. Shrove Tuesday pancakes persisted. They had become something both less and more than they had been, less theologically freighted perhaps, but more deeply embedded in domestic life, in the small rituals that make a house a home and a collection of individuals a family. As the 17th century dawned and Europe's religious wars ground toward their exhausted conclusion, Lent and Shrove Tuesday stood as reminders of both continuity and change. The traditions had survived, but they had been transformed, fractured, reimagined, and their journey through history was far from over. As we cross into the 17th and 18th centuries, our story must expand beyond Europe's borders, because something remarkable was happening. The traditions of Lent and Shrove Tuesday, born in the Mediterranean world and shaped by medieval European Christianity, were about to become global phenomena, transformed, adapted, and reimagined in ways their originators could never have anticipated. The ships that left European ports carried many things: soldiers and settlers, diseases and dreams, Bibles and weapons. But they also carried calendars, the invisible architecture of time that told people when to work and when to rest, when to fast and when to feast. And wherever Catholics went, to the Americas, to the Philippines, to parts of Africa and Asia, They brought Lent and Shrove Tuesday with them. But here's what makes this story so rich. These weren't simply European traditions transplanted unchanged to foreign soil. They were living practices that would meet other living cultures. And in that meeting, something new would be born. Consider the Caribbean, where Spanish and French colonizers encountered indigenous Taino and Carib peoples, and where the horrific Atlantic slave trade was bringing hundreds of thousands of Africans against their will. When French Catholics celebrated Mardi Gras in these islands, the celebration couldn't remain purely European. African enslaved people, forbidden to practice their own religions openly, began to encode their own traditions within the acceptable framework of Catholic festivals. Carnival in Trinidad, which would eventually become one of the world's most spectacular celebrations, began in the late 18th century as a French Catholic observance. The plantation owners and colonial elite would hold elaborate masked balls before Lent, imitating the carnival traditions of Paris and Lyon. But enslaved Africans developed their own parallel celebrations, incorporating West African musical traditions, rhythms, and spiritual practices disguised as Christian observance. After emancipation in 1834, these formerly suppressed traditions exploded into public view, transforming Trinidad's carnival into something profoundly different from its European origins, a celebration of freedom, resistance, and cultural survival. In Latin America, the story was similarly complex. Spanish conquistadors and missionaries were rigid in their insistence that indigenous people adopt Christian practices, including Lent. But the indigenous peoples of Mexico, Peru, and throughout Central and South America had their own elaborate calendrical systems, their own festivals, their own understandings of time's sacred rhythms. What emerged was syncretism, the blending of traditions. In Mexico, pre-Lenten celebrations incorporated elements of Aztec spring festivals. In the Andes, Catholic Lenten processions merged with indigenous rituals honoring Pachamama, the Earth Mother. The church authorities sometimes fought these blendings, seeing them as corruption of pure Christian practice. But often they accepted them, recognizing that faith takes root in local soil or it doesn't take root at all. Brazil's Carnival, which would eventually become perhaps the world's most famous pre-Lenten celebration, emerged from this complex cultural mixing. Portuguese Catholics brought their Shrovetide traditions, the intrudo, a celebration involving water fights and flower throwing. African enslaved people contributed their musical traditions, their dances, their spiritual practices. Indigenous peoples added their own elements. By the 19th century, Rio de Janeiro's Carnival was becoming something unprecedented, a massive, multi-day street festival that was simultaneously Catholic and African, European and American, sacred and profane. Meanwhile, in North America, different patterns were emerging. The English Puritans who settled in New England wanted nothing to do with Shrove Tuesday or Lent. They saw these as Catholic corruptions, remnants of a false religion. Their calendar acknowledged only the Sabbath as holy time. Every other day was simply for work and basic survival. There would be no pancakes, no carnival, no festive threshold before penitential season. The simplicity was intentional, even severe. But in Louisiana, French Catholic settlers were creating something different. When Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville and his party landed at a place they called Point du Mardi Gras on March 3rd, 1699, which happened to be Fat Tuesday, they marked the occasion with a celebration. This was the seed that would eventually grow into New Orleans Mardi Gras, though that development would take more than a century. New Orleans in the 18th and early 19th centuries was a cultural crossroads unlike anywhere else in North America. French Catholics, Spanish Catholics, free people of color, enslaved Africans, Caribbean immigrants, Native Americans. All these groups lived in close proximity, and their traditions mixed and merged. Mardi Gras in New Orleans became a celebration that reflected this incredible diversity, incorporating European masked balls, African drumming and dance, Caribbean carnival traditions, and uniquely American elements. Interestingly, as these traditions were exploding and evolving in the colonial worlds, back in Europe, they were often becoming more constrained, more domesticated. The Enlightenment of the 18th century brought new ideas about reason, order, and progress. Civic authorities in many European cities began to see carnival's chaos as dangerous, uncivilized, a threat to public order. In England, the rowdy football matches and street celebrations of Shrovetide were increasingly suppressed by local authorities who viewed them as primitive and disorderly. Pancakes remained, but the wider carnival elements faded. Shrove Tuesday was becoming a domestic, kitchen-centered observance rather than a public festival. Middle-class Victorian reformers, in particular, would later work to tame any remaining excesses, promoting a vision of Shrove Tuesday as a wholesome family day centered on church attendance and modest pancake suppers. Yet even as European elites tried to sanitize their carnival traditions, those same traditions were flourishing in wilder, more exuberant forms across the oceans. There's a beautiful irony here. The colonies became the keepers of Carnival's transgressive spirit, while the metropolitan centers grew more restrained. The Lenten fast itself was also changing during this period. The Catholic Church's rules remained officially strict, but enforcement was becoming more difficult, especially in far-flung colonial territories. How do you maintain medieval European fasting rules in the Amazon, where the available foods are completely different? What counts as fish in the Philippines? Can indigenous converts eat their traditional foods during Lent, or must they adopt European dietary patterns? Jesuit missionaries, known for their cultural adaptability, often found creative solutions. In Japan, before Christianity was suppressed there, Jesuits allowed certain local foods during Lent that would have been forbidden in Europe. In Paraguay, the Jesuit missions developed their own interpretations of Lenten observance suited to local conditions. The Church in Rome sometimes approved these adaptations, sometimes condemned them, but the practical reality of distance and communication delays meant that local practices often evolved independently. There is also growing economic pressure on Lenten fasting rules. As European capitalism expanded and global trade networks developed, food was increasingly a commodity bought and sold rather than something grown and stored locally. Merchants who dealt in meat and dairy products lobbied for relaxed Lenten restrictions, arguing they caused economic hardship. Gradually, in Catholic countries, dispensations became more common. Permissions to eat meat on certain days, exemptions for laborers doing heavy work, allowances for the sick or traveling. By the end of the 18th century, Lent was still widely observed across the Catholic world, but it was observed in countless different ways. A wealthy merchant in Madrid, a Jesuit priest in Beijing, an enslaved person on a Haitian sugar plantation, a Quechua-speaking indigenous person in the Peruvian highlands. All might mark the Lenten season, but their experiences would be vastly different. What's remarkable is that through all this diversity, the basic pattern held. There was a before and an after, a time of relative plenty and a time of restriction, a threshold marked by special foods and special observances. The human need for rhythm, for markers in time, for collective participation in shared patterns. This proved more durable than any specific rule or practice. The Atlantic world of the 17th and 18th centuries was characterized by horrific violence. the genocide of indigenous peoples, the brutality of slavery, the exploitation of colonial rule. But it was also a space where cultures met and merged in unprecedented ways. And the traditions of Shrove Tuesday and Lent became, unexpectedly, part of that cultural conversation. When an African drummer in Salvador, Brazil, played rhythms during Carnival that echoed both West African religious ceremonies and Catholic processional music, he was creating something new, not European, not African, but Afro-Brazilian. When a mestizo family in Mexico City made special sweetbreads for Lent that combined Spanish recipes with local ingredients and indigenous techniques, they were writing a new chapter in the story we're telling. These weren't just quaint cultural adaptations. They were acts of survival, resistance, creativity, and faith. People took traditions that had been imposed on them or offered to them, and they made those traditions their own, infused them with their own meanings, their own memories, their own hopes. As the 18th century drew to a close and revolution was in the air, in America, in France, soon across Latin America, the old certainties were crumbling. Monarchies would fall, empires would collapse, new nations would be born, and through it all, people would continue to mark the passage of time with fasts and feasts, with pancakes and processions, with the rhythms that connected them to their ancestors and to each other. The story of Lent and Shrove Tuesday had become a global story, written in 1,000 languages, flavored with 1,000 cuisines, celebrated in 1,000 ways. And it was far from finished. The 19th century dawned with the echoes of revolution still ringing across Europe and the Americas. The old order of kings and emperors, of unquestioned church authority, of traditions passed down unchanged from generation to generation, was under siege. And in this new world being born, the question arose, what place did ancient practices like Lent and Shrove Tuesday have in an age of reason, progress, and individual liberty? The answer, it turned out, was complicated. In France, the Revolution of 1789 had attempted something extraordinary, the complete reorganization of time itself. The revolutionaries created a new calendar with new months, new week lengths, and new holidays designed to celebrate reason and Republican virtue rather than Christian saints. The old Catholic festivals, including Lent and Mardi Gras, were officially abolished. Churches were closed, priests were persecuted, and the revolutionary government declared that humanity had outgrown such superstitions. It didn't last, of course. Napoleon restored the traditional calendar and made peace with the Catholic Church. But something had been proven. The sacred calendar was not eternal and unchangeable. It could be challenged, rejected, replaced. Even though France returned to its Catholic festivals, the knowledge that they could be abolished, that they were choices rather than inevitabilities, fundamentally altered their character. Across Europe in the 19th century, industrialization was transforming how people experienced time itself. For centuries, work had followed natural rhythms, the seasons, the daylight, the agricultural calendar. Lent fit naturally into this world. It came during late winter and early spring, the hungry season when food stores were low anyway. Fasting during Lent was partly religious discipline and partly simple reality. But factory work followed a different rhythm. Machines didn't care about seasons or saints' days. The factory whistle blew at the same time whether it was Lent or Easter, winter or summer. Workers needed steady, predictable energy to tend the machines for 12, 14, 16 hours a day. The idea of significantly reducing food intake during Lent became, for many industrial workers, simply impractical. You couldn't operate dangerous machinery on an empty stomach. The Catholic Church found itself in a difficult position. The official rules remained strict, but church leaders increasingly recognized that requiring rigorous Lenten fasting from factory workers might be asking the impossible. More dispensations were granted. The rules were gradually relaxed. By the mid-19th century, in most Catholic countries, the Lenten fast had been reduced to abstaining from meat on Fridays and fasting only on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. It was still meaningful, still observed, but nothing like the comprehensive 40-day fast of medieval times. Interestingly, even as the religious content of Lent was weakening in some circles, Shrove Tuesday was often growing stronger as a cultural celebration. In Britain, Pancake Day became more popular, not less, during the Victorian era. Part of this was the Victorian obsession with domesticity and tradition. They loved the idea of old customs, quaint village practices, the merry England of their imagination. Shrove Tuesday, with its pancakes and church bells, fit perfectly into this nostalgic vision. British cookbooks of the 19th century show an explosion of pancake recipes, each claiming to be authentic, traditional, passed down through generations. Some probably were. Others were Victorian inventions dressed up as ancient customs. But it didn't really matter. What mattered was the sense of connection to the past, the feeling that in making pancakes on Shrove Tuesday, you were participating in something larger than yourself, something that stretched back through time. The British Empire, at its height during the 19th century, spread these traditions around the world. In Australia, Canada, India, South Africa, wherever the British established colonial presence, they brought their calendar and their customs. Shrove Tuesday and Lent arrived in places where they had no natural connection to the climate or culture. In Australia, for instance, Shrove Tuesday fell in late summer, not late winter. There was no using up of winter stores before spring planting. But the tradition was transplanted anyway, maintained as a marker of British identity, a connection to the homeland. Australian children grew up making pancakes in February heat, participating in a ritual that made perfect sense in England, but was climatically absurd in the Southern Hemisphere. Meanwhile, in the United States, something fascinating was happening. The country was becoming more diverse, more pluralistic, more secular in its public institutions, even as it remained deeply religious in its private life. Lent and Shrove Tuesday existed in this tension. In heavily Catholic areas, Louisiana, the Southwest, parts of the urban Northeast with large Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrant populations, Lent remained central to community life. Mardi Gras in New Orleans was growing into a major civic event, with elaborate crews, carnival organizations, parades, balls, and costumes. By the mid-19th century, the mystic crew of Comus had established many of the traditions that would define New Orleans Mardi Gras. The parade floats, the throws, the royal courts. This was Carnival as spectacular civic theater, drawing tourists and celebrating local identity. But in Protestant America, particularly in areas dominated by evangelical Christianity, Lent was either ignored or actively rejected. Some Protestant denominations, Episcopalians, Lutherans, maintained Lenten observance, though usually in a more subdued form than Catholics. But Baptists, Methodists, and other evangelical groups typically saw no need for a liturgical calendar at all. Every Sunday was Easter. Every day was an opportunity for repentance. The idea of a special season for spiritual focus seemed, to many Protestants, to miss the point of continuous devotion. This created an interesting cultural split. In some American cities, you might have Irish Catholic neighborhoods where everyone knew it was Lent, the fish dinners on Friday, the giving up of sweets or alcohol, the extra prayer services. A few blocks away, in a Protestant neighborhood, people might be completely unaware that Lent was happening at all. The late 19th century also saw the rise of what we might call dietary Lent, people giving up foods or luxuries for health reasons rather than religious ones. The era's obsession with self-improvement, physical culture, and moral reform created a context where the discipline of Lent made sense even outside its religious framework. Temperance movements encouraged giving up alcohol. Health reformers promoted periodic fasting. The basic pattern of denial followed by celebration, restriction followed by release, proved psychologically powerful even when stripped of its theological content. Scientific and medical thinking was also changing how people understood fasting and diet. Nutrition was becoming a science. Doctors were discovering vitamins, understanding metabolism, developing theories about optimal diets. Some of these new scientific ideas seemed to support traditional Lenten practices. Periodic fasting might be healthy. Others challenged them. Children need consistent nutrition to grow properly. You can't just restrict their diet for 40 days. The Catholic Church had to navigate these new scientific claims carefully. When doctors said that certain people shouldn't fast for health reasons, was that a valid excuse? How did you balance religious obligation with medical advice? These questions, which would have been almost unthinkable in the medieval period, became increasingly common and increasingly difficult. In intellectual circles, meanwhile, Lent and other religious observances faced a different kind of challenge: the rise of secularism and religious skepticism. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859, and while it didn't directly address Lent, it contributed to a broader questioning of religious authority and traditional practice. If humans were not specially created, but evolved like other animals, what did that mean for religious practices designed to discipline the flesh and elevate the spirit? Karl Marx famously called religion the opium of the people, and many socialists and communists saw Lent and other religious festivals as tools of social control, distractions that kept the working class from recognizing their exploitation. Why should workers give up meat during Lent when they could barely afford meat anyway? Better to fight for economic justice than to sanctify poverty through religious observance. Yet even as these intellectual and social challenges mounted, Lent and Shrove Tuesday proved remarkably resilient. Part of this resilience came from their flexibility. They could be observed in strict traditional ways or adapted to modern circumstances. Part came from their social and cultural functions that went beyond the explicitly religious. Shrove Tuesday pancake suppers brought communities together. Lent provided structure and rhythm to the year. These things had value even for people whose religious commitment was wavering. There's a poignant quality to many 19th century accounts of Lent and Shrove Tuesday. You can sense in parish records and personal diaries, in cookbooks and church bulletins, a world in transition. People participated in these traditions, but with growing uncertainty about what they meant. Were they sacred duties or quaint customs, ancient wisdom or outdated superstition? The answer often seemed to be both, somehow, simultaneously. By the century's end, the industrial world had fundamentally transformed. Cities had grown enormous. Technology was advancing at an unprecedented pace. The world had been mapped, connected by telegraph and steamship, made smaller and faster. Traditional rhythms of seasons, of agricultural cycles, of religious calendars were being overlaid with new rhythms of factory shifts, train schedules, stock market hours. And yet, as winter turned to spring in 1900, people across the world still made their pancakes, still marked Ash Wednesday, still observed Lent in whatever way made sense to them. The traditions had survived revolution and industrialization, skepticism and science. They had been transformed, certainly, made less universal, less rigorous, less central to daily life. But they had survived. The 20th century was about to dawn, bringing with it wars and upheavals that would make the 19th century's changes seem almost quaint. And through it all, Lent and Shrove Tuesday would continue to evolve, to adapt, to find new meanings and new purposes. The story was far from over. The 20th century opened with optimism in many quarters, a belle epoque of progress, prosperity, and confidence in humanity's future. But within 15 years, that optimism would be shattered in the trenches of World War I, and the traditions of Lent and Shrove Tuesday would face challenges unlike any they had encountered before. Imagine Shrove Tuesday, 1916, in London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and all the great cities of Europe. Families tried to maintain their traditions. Pancakes were made, though with increasing difficulty. Sugar was rationed. Eggs were scarce. Butter was precious. The simple act of making traditional Shrove Tuesday pancakes became a small act of defiance against the war's deprivations, a way of insisting that normal life, peacetime life, still existed somewhere beneath the surface of this nightmare. But in the trenches, in the mud and blood of Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, Lent took on a terrible new meaning. Soldiers didn't need to give up meat for Lent. They were already starving. They didn't need to practice self-denial. The war had stripped everything from them already. Some chaplains try to maintain Lenten observances in the trenches, conducting Ash Wednesday services amid the artillery fire. But the very idea of voluntary fasting seemed almost obscene when men were dying of malnutrition and exposure. And yet, paradoxically, religious observance often intensified in the trenches. When facing death daily, many soldiers turned to faith with new urgency. Lent became not about following rules, but about seeking meaning in meaningless suffering, about finding hope in a world that seemed to have abandoned hope. The prayers and rituals of Lent, practiced for centuries, provided a familiar structure in a world turned chaotic. There's a recorded instance from the Western Front of British and German soldiers observing an informal truce on Ash Wednesday 1915, long after the famous Christmas truce of 1914. The killing paused, briefly, as men on both sides received ashes and prayed. Then the war resumed. It's a haunting image, ancient ritual persisting even in modernity's most mechanized, industrialized slaughter. The war ended, but its effects rippled through the following decades. The 1920s saw a reaction against Victorian restraint and traditional morality. In cities like Paris, Berlin, and New York, Mardi Gras and Carnival celebrations became more elaborate, more decadent, more deliberately transgressive. This wasn't the medieval carnival's sanctioned excess before religious discipline. This was a generation that had seen the collapse of the old order and wasn't sure they believed in any order at all. Jazz-age Mardi Gras in New Orleans became famous for hedonism. Prohibition in the United States made New Orleans, with its more relaxed attitude toward alcohol laws, even more attractive as a destination for carnival revelry. The religious context didn't disappear entirely, but it receded. For many participants, Mardi Gras was simply a party, a celebration, an excuse for costumes and music and dancing. The fact that Lent followed the next day seemed almost incidental. Then came the Great Depression, and once again, Lent took on new resonance. When the stock market crashed in 1929, millions of people found themselves facing the kind of deprivation that Lent had traditionally imposed voluntarily. Going without meat wasn't a spiritual discipline. It was economic necessity. Some religious leaders tried to reframe this suffering as an opportunity for spiritual growth, suggesting that the Depression was teaching people the lessons of Lent, that material wealth wasn't ultimate, that community mattered more than possessions, that suffering could be redemptive. But for many people, the Depression soured them on the idea of voluntary deprivation. Why would you give up food for Lent when you didn't have enough food anyway? The Protestant work ethic that had shaped much of American culture began to seem like a cruel joke when there was no work to be had. Catholic worker houses, founded by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin in 1933, operated soup kitchens that stayed open through Lent, feeding the hungry regardless of the day or season. This was a new kind of Lenten observance, one that focused less on personal fasting and more on feeding others, less on individual sacrifice and more on social justice. Then came World War II, and once again, traditional observances collided with wartime reality. In Britain, rationing made traditional Shrove Tuesday pancakes nearly impossible. Government pamphlets offered recipes for eggless pancakes, or pancakes made with dried egg powder, trying to maintain the tradition within severe constraints. It was important for morale, authorities believed, to keep these traditions alive. They reminded people what they were fighting for, the normal life that would return when victory came. In occupied Europe, maintaining religious traditions became an act of resistance. The Nazis, while initially tolerating Catholic practice in some areas, increasingly tried to suppress or control religious observances. Celebrating Lent, observing Ash Wednesday, making pancakes on Shrove Tuesday, these became small rebellions, assertions of identity and faith against totalitarian control. There's a remarkable account from the Warsaw Ghetto of Jews who, even in the midst of unspeakable horror, noted their Catholic neighbors' observance of Lent. Some Jewish diarists wrote about how the Catholic holidays continued to mark time, providing a kind of calendar even as the normal world collapsed. It's a reminder that these traditions, however transformed, still serve their ancient function, marking time, creating rhythm, connecting communities. After World War II, the world changed again, fundamentally and irrevocably. The atomic age had begun. The colonial empires were collapsing. Europe's dominance was ending. And in this new world, Lent and Shrove Tuesday would have to find their place yet again. The 1950s in the United States and Western Europe saw a religious revival. Church attendance increased. Traditional practices returned, or seemed to return, with renewed vigor. Suburban Catholic families observed Lent faithfully. Fish on Fridays, giving up candy or movies, attending special services. It looked, on the surface, like a return to older certainties. But underneath, the culture was shifting. Television was changing how people experienced time and entertainment. Consumer culture was exploding. The post-war boom created unprecedented prosperity, and with it, unprecedented temptation. How do you practice meaningful self-denial in a culture built on consumption? How do you fast in the land of plenty? The Catholic Church itself was grappling with these questions. The Second Vatican Council, convened by Pope John XXI in 1962, would eventually transform Catholic practice in profound ways. While the Council's documents said relatively little about Lent specifically, its overall thrust toward modernization and adaptation affected how Lent was understood and practiced. After Vatican II, the rules around Lenten fasting were significantly relaxed. Meat abstinence was reduced to Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, and Fridays during Lent, and even then, with many exceptions. The idea was to make Lent less about following rules and more about genuine spiritual renewal. Priests encouraged people to choose their own Lenten practices, to find disciplines that were personally meaningful rather than simply following prescribed regulations. This was liberating for some, confusing for others. If you could choose what to give up for Lent, did it still mean anything? If the rules weren't mandatory, would people observe them at all? These questions played out differently in different communities, but overall, the trend was toward a more voluntary, personalized approach to Lent. Meanwhile, Shrove Tuesday was evolving in interesting ways. In Britain, it had become almost entirely secularized as Pancake Day, a fun food holiday, especially beloved by children, with only tenuous connections to its religious origins. Pancake races became national news. Schools held pancake-making competitions. Supermarkets promoted pancake ingredients. The religious context hadn't entirely disappeared, but for many British people, Pancake Day was simply a delightful tradition, full stop. In the United States, Mardi Gras in New Orleans had become a major tourist industry. By the 1960s and 70s, hundreds of thousands of visitors descended on the city each year for Carnival. The celebration was enormous, elaborate, commercially successful, and increasingly distant from its religious roots. Most tourists didn't attend Ash Wednesday services. They came for the party, not the prayer. Yet even in this commercialized context, something of the original spirit survived. The crews that organized Mardi Gras still followed traditional patterns. The timing was still tied to Easter, still calculated according to the ancient church calendar. And many New Orleans residents, native to the city and its culture, still observed the full cycle. The wild celebration of Mardi Gras, followed by the solemn beginning of Lent. The late 20th century saw growing religious pluralism in traditionally Christian countries. Immigration brought new religious traditions, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, to Europe and North America in significant numbers. In this context, Lent became less a shared communal experience and more one option among many religious practices. But this pluralism also created new interest in religious traditions. Some people, feeling unmoored in a secular culture, turned to practices like Lent seeking structure, meaning, ritual. Even some non-Christians began adopting Lenten practices, giving something up for 40 days, using it as a period of intentional reflection and self-improvement. The environmental movement of the 1970s and beyond gave new meaning to Lenten fasting. Reducing consumption, eating less meat, practicing simplicity, these Lenten disciplines aligned with environmental concerns. Some Christians began framing Lent as a season to focus on creation care, to reduce their ecological footprint, to live more sustainably. Ancient practice found new purpose. As the 20th century drew to a close, Lent and Shrove Tuesday existed in a bewildering variety of forms. There were people who observed them with medieval rigor. Others followed relaxed modern rules. Some had transformed them into purely cultural celebrations. Still others had abandoned them entirely or never known them in the first place. The century had brought world wars, technological revolution, social upheaval, and cultural transformation. Through it all, these ancient traditions had adapted, evolved, splintered into countless variations. They had proven remarkably resilient, but also remarkably plastic, capable of meaning different things to different people in different contexts. As the new millennium approached, the question remained, what would Lent and Shrove Tuesday become in the 21st century? The answer, as we'll see, would be as complex and varied as the global culture itself. As the 21st century began, Lent and Shrove Tuesday stood at a curious crossroads. These traditions, born in the ancient Mediterranean world, shaped by medieval theology, transformed by Reformation and Revolution, scattered across the globe by empire. What would they become in the age of the internet, of smartphones, of global connectivity and instant communication? The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, was more diverse, more visible, and more contested than ever before. One of the most striking developments of the early 21st century was the way social media transformed how people experienced and shared Lenten practices. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, these platforms created new ways of making private devotion public, of sharing what previous generations might have kept between themselves and God. People began posting about what they were giving up for Lent: chocolate, coffee, social media itself. They shared photos of their Shrove Tuesday pancakes, their Ash Wednesday ashes, their meatless Friday meals. This created a curious dynamic. The ancient practice of Lenten self-denial became, for some, an opportunity for self-presentation, for broadcasting one's spirituality to an online audience. Critics pointed out the irony. Wasn't Lent supposed to be about humility, about private devotion rather than public display? Didn't Jesus himself warn against praying on street corners to be seen by others? But defenders noted that this public sharing could be a form of witness, of mutual encouragement, of building community across distance. Medieval Christians had their parish communities to support them through Lent. Perhaps online communities served a similar function in a more scattered, mobile society. The internet also enabled entirely new forms of Lenten practice. Apps appeared to help people track their Lenten commitments, sending daily reminders and inspirational messages. Websites offered Lenten devotional readings, meditation guides, even virtual stations of the cross that could be experienced from home. Podcasts explored Lenten themes. YouTube featured cooking shows demonstrating traditional Lenten recipes from around the world. This digitalization of Lent raised interesting questions. If you give up social media for Lent, but use a prayer app, are you really disconnecting from technology? If you observe Lent by following an online devotional guide, is that fundamentally different from reading a prayer book? The boundaries between sacred and secular, online and offline, became increasingly blurred. Meanwhile, Shrove Tuesday was experiencing its own digital transformation. The hashtag Pancake Day trended annually on Twitter in the UK, with people sharing photos of their creations, debating the proper toppings. Lemon and sugar versus Nutella became a minor culture war, and posting videos of pancake flipping disasters. What had been a domestic, kitchen center tradition became a shared digital experience, connecting millions of people across the country and around the world. In the United States, Mardi Gras in New Orleans entered the social media age with full force. The parades, the costumes, the music, all of it became content to be captured and shared. But this also created tensions. Was the constant documenting and posting destroying the in-the-moment experience of Carnival? When thousands of people held up phones to photograph the parade instead of simply watching it, had something essential been lost? The early 21st century also saw a growing awareness of what we might call Lent fatigue or Lent skepticism, particularly among younger Christians. Many millennials and Gen Z Christians questioned whether giving up chocolate or coffee for 40 days had any real spiritual value. Some argued that Lent had become performative, more about following a tradition than about genuine transformation. In response, many churches and religious leaders began emphasizing what they called giving up versus taking on. Instead of just giving up something, the new approach suggested adding positive practices, volunteering, daily prayer, acts of kindness, environmental activism. Instead of self-denial for its own sake, Lent became about active engagement with justice, compassion, and service. This shift reflected broader changes in how many Christians, especially younger ones, understood their faith. There was less emphasis on personal piety, separated from social action, and more on what some called incarnational Christianity, faith that engaged directly with the world's suffering and injustice. Some churches organized carbon fasts for Lent, encouraging people to reduce their environmental impact. Others focused on economic justice, asking members to examine their consumption patterns and their complicity in exploitative systems. Still others emphasized racial justice, using Lent as a time to learn about systemic racism and work toward reconciliation. These new approaches to Lent sometimes created generational divides. Older Catholics who remembered meatless Fridays and strict fasting rules sometimes felt that Lent was being watered down, made too easy, stripped of its penitential character. Younger people often felt that their elders were focused on trivial rules while missing Lent's deeper call to transformation and justice. The Catholic Church itself continued to navigate these tensions. Pope Francis, elected in 2013, brought a new emphasis on mercy, simplicity, and concern for the poor. His Lenten messages focused less on individual sacrifice and more on solidarity with suffering people, on environmental stewardship, on economic justice. This resonated with many younger Catholics, but sometimes puzzled those expecting more traditional emphases. In 2020, something unprecedented happened: the COVID-19 pandemic. As Lent began in late February, the coronavirus was already spreading globally. By Ash Wednesday, many churches were closing, moving services online, restricting gatherings. Within weeks, the entire world was in lockdown. Lent 2020 became unlike any Lent in living memory. Churches were empty. People received ashes in drive-through ceremonies or watched Ash Wednesday services on screens at home. Shrove Tuesday celebrations were canceled. Mardi Gras in New Orleans proceeded. But within weeks, the city became a coronavirus hotspot, and many wondered if the celebration had contributed to the spread. The pandemic forced a radical reimagining of religious practice. How do you observe Lent when you can't attend church? How do you maintain community when you're isolated at home? Many churches offered online Lenten services, Zoom prayer groups, live stream masses. It was Lent by necessity, enforced withdrawal from normal life, separation from community, a season of loss and limitation that no one had chosen, but everyone had to endure. Some religious leaders noted the irony. The entire world was being forced to experience something like the discipline Lent had always invited people to choose voluntarily. We were separated from loved ones, deprived of normal pleasures, faced with mortality and uncertainty. The pandemic was, in a sense, an involuntary Lent that extended far beyond 40 days. When Lent 2021 arrived, many people approached it differently. Having lived through a year of forced deprivation, some felt no desire to add voluntary restrictions. Others found new meaning in Lenten practices precisely because they had experienced real loss and wanted to process it spiritually. The pandemic had stripped away the comfortable illusion that we controlled our lives, that security and stability were guaranteed. Lessons that Lent had always tried to teach, but that now felt urgently, terribly real. The pandemic also highlighted global inequalities in stark ways. While some people observed Lent by giving up luxuries they could easily resume after 40 days, others faced genuine hunger, genuine isolation, genuine fear. This raised uncomfortable questions. Was Lent meaningful when deprivation was a choice rather than a necessity? How should privileged people practice Lent in a world where billions lack the basic securities that made voluntary fasting possible. Some Christians responded by using Lent to engage more directly with these inequalities, raising money for vaccine access in poor countries, supporting food banks, advocating for better healthcare systems. Lent became, for some, a season of solidarity rather than just personal discipline. As we move through the 2020s, new patterns are still emerging. Climate change has made the seasonal timing of Lent feel different. In many places, late winter isn't what it used to be. The hungry season that once gave Lent its natural context is less predictable, complicated by droughts, floods, and shifting weather patterns. Political polarization has affected how people observe Lent too. In the United States especially, cultural battles over religious freedom, secularism, and the role of Christianity in public life have made every religious practice potentially political. Some Christians emphasize traditional Lenten disciplines as a way of asserting religious identity in an increasingly secular culture. Others use Lent to critique that very impulse, focusing on justice and inclusion rather than tradition and boundary marking. The rise of spiritual but not religious people, those who seek meaning and practice outside institutional religion, has also affected Lent. Some non-Christians adopt Lenten practices, finding value in periodic simplification, in intentional reflection, in communal ritual, even without the theological framework. This bothers some traditional believers, but intrigues others who see it as evidence that these ancient practices speak to something fundamentally human. Technology continues to reshape the experience. Virtual reality might soon allow people to visit historical Lenten observances, to experience medieval Easter vigils or 19th century Shrove Tuesday celebrations. Artificial intelligence might offer personalized Lenten guidance, adapting ancient wisdom to individual circumstances. The possibilities are both exciting and unsettling. And yet, through all this change and uncertainty, something persists. As winter turns towards spring each year, millions of people still mark this threshold. They still make their pancakes, receive their ashes, choose their fasts, walk their Lenten journeys. The forms change, the meanings shift, the context transform, but the pattern endures. It endures because, perhaps, humans need rhythms, need seasons, need structured time for reflection and renewal. It endures because communities need shared practices that bind them together across differences. It endures because the questions Lent asks, questions about desire and discipline, abundance and scarcity, the body and the spirit, death and resurrection, are perennial questions, as urgent today as they were 1,500 years ago. As we approach the conclusion of our journey through history, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at another threshold, another moment of transformation. What will Lent and Shrove Tuesday become in the decades ahead? The answer is still being written. To truly understand what Lent and Shrove Tuesday have become in our contemporary world, we need to circle the globe to see how these traditions, born in one small corner of the Mediterranean, have taken root in wildly different soils, producing variations as diverse as humanity itself. Let us begin our journey in Rio de Janeiro, where Carnival has become perhaps the world's most spectacular pre-Lenten celebration. What happens in Rio during the week before Lent is almost beyond description, a citywide explosion of color, music, dance, and costume that draws millions of participants and observers. The Samba schools, community organizations that spend the entire year preparing for Carnival, parade through the Sambadrome, a purpose-built stadium, in competitions judged on choreography, costumes, music, and overall spectacle. Each school tells a story, often one that engages with Brazilian history, social issues, or cultural identity. Thousands of dancers move in perfect synchronization, wearing costumes that cost thousands of dollars and weigh dozens of pounds, covered in feathers, sequins, and elaborate headdresses. This is Carnival as civic art form, as social commentary, as economic engine. It employs tens of thousands of people, generates hundreds of millions in revenue, and serves as a moment when Brazil presents itself to the world. The religious context that this celebration precedes Lent is still acknowledged, but for many participants and observers, it has become secondary to the cultural significance. Yet even in Rio, there are those who maintain the connection. After the parades end, after the street parties disperse, after the costumes are packed away, Ash Wednesday arrives. Churches fill with people, some of them the same people who were dancing in the streets hours before, receiving ashes, beginning the Lenten journey. The juxtaposition is jarring and profound. From the most excessive celebration imaginable to the solemnity of Remember You Are Dust. Travel north to New Orleans, and you find a different expression of similar themes. Mardi Gras here is a peculiarly New Orleans creation, part French Catholic tradition, part American commercialism, part African American cultural expression, part tourist spectacle. The cruise parade with elaborate floats, throwing beads and trinkets to crowds. The French Quarter fills with revelers. Music pours from every doorway. But New Orleans Mardi Gras has layers that casual observers often miss. The traditional cruise, comus, rex, momus, maintain practices dating back more than a century. The Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club, founded by Black New Orleanians in 1909, presents a parade that both celebrates and satirizes Mardi Gras traditions. The Mardi Gras Indians, African-American groups who create stunning hand-beaded suits, connect Carnival to traditions of resistance and cultural preservation. And then there's the food. King cakes, oval pastries decorated in purple, green, and gold, containing a hidden plastic baby, appear in bakeries starting January 6th and disappear after Mardi Gras. The tradition is that whoever gets the baby in their slice must provide the next king cake. It's a small ritual that binds community together, a way of marking the season through taste and tradition. Across the ocean, in Venice, Carnival takes yet another form. Here, the emphasis is on masks, elaborate, artistic, sometimes unsettling creations that allow wearers to become anonymous, to play different roles, to cross social boundaries that normally constrain them. Venetian Carnival has deep historical roots, dating back to the Middle Ages, when the wearing of masks allowed nobles and commoners to mingle, when social hierarchies were temporarily suspended. The Venetian tradition nearly died in the 20th century, but was revived in the 1970s as a tourist attraction and cultural statement. Now, during the weeks before Lent, Venice fills with people in period costumes and ornate masks, creating a dreamlike atmosphere where past and present blur together. It's Carnival as theater, as living history, as defiant beauty in a city threatened by rising seas and mass tourism. Travel to Germany, to cities like Cologne or Mainz, and you encounter Fasching or Carnival, celebrations that blend ancient Germanic traditions with Catholic practice. Here, Carnival includes political satire, with parade floats mocking politicians and current events. The 11th of the 11th, at 11:11 a.m. marks the beginning of Carnival season, though the main celebrations happen in the week before Lent. German Carnival has its own traditions. The Rosenmontag, Rose Monday, parades, the awarding of the Order of Fools, the ritual storming of city halls by carnival revelers. During these days, normal rules are suspended. Cross-dressing is common. Authority is mocked. It's the medieval world upside-down tradition alive and well in the 21st century. In Poland, the Thursday before Lent, Tłusty Czwartek, or Fat Thursday, is marked by the consumption of paczki, rich donuts filled with jam or cream. Bakeries produce millions of these treats, and it's traditional to eat at least one, preferably several. The custom is so strong that it survived even the communist era's attempts to suppress religious observances. Paczki weren't explicitly religious. After all, they were just delicious. The Philippines, with its deep Spanish Catholic influence, observes Lent with particular intensity. Holy Week features dramatic processions, passion plays that can last for hours, and in some communities, actual crucifixions, volunteers having themselves nailed to crosses as acts of penance and devotion. It's a practice the Catholic Church officially discourages, but cannot entirely stop, rooted in a faux Catholicism that blends indigenous and Spanish elements. But before Lent arrives, there are the Panagbenga festivals, beauty contests, and street dancing. Filipino Carnival isn't as well known internationally as Brazilian or Venetian, but it's equally vibrant, reflecting the Filipino genius for celebration, for color, for communal joy. In Ethiopia, where Christianity took root in the 4th century, nearly as early as in Europe, Lent is called Hadadi or Abit Psalm, Great Fast. It's observed with extraordinary rigor, with Orthodox Christians fasting for 55 days, abstaining from all animal products, eating only after 3 p.m. on weekdays. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved practices that the Western Church long ago modified or abandoned, offering a window into what ancient Christianity looked like. Ethiopian cuisine has evolved to accommodate these long fasts. An entire category of dishes, Yetzam Mejub, fasting food, features lentils, vegetables, and grains prepared without any animal products. Injera, the spongy flatbread that's Ethiopia's staple food, becomes even more central during Lent. Fasting isn't just about restriction, it's about a different way of eating, of nourishing the body while disciplining it. In India, where Christians are a small but significant minority, Lent takes on local flavors. In Goa, with its Portuguese Catholic heritage, Lenten fish curries replace meat dishes. In Kerala, where Syrian Christianity has existed since the 1st century, Lenten practices blend Middle Eastern and South Asian traditions. The pre-Lenten carnival in Goa includes the intrus, a figure representing disorder who is judged and burned on Shrove Tuesday evening, purging the community before Lent begins. Even in places where Christianity is extremely recent or remains a minority religion, Lenten traditions have appeared, adapted, transformed. In South Korea, where Christianity has grown explosively in the past century, Lent is observed by millions, often with a distinctly Korean emphasis on community fasting, collective prayer, and intensive Bible study that reflects Korean cultural values around education and group solidarity. In Japan, where Christians represent less than 2% of the population, a few Catholic and Protestant communities observe Lent, but they do so in a culture that has its own rich traditions of seasonal observance, ritual purity, and aesthetic simplicity. Some Japanese Christians note parallels between Lenten discipline and Zen Buddhist practices, finding points of connection between traditions. What's striking about this global survey is both the unity and the diversity. Everywhere, there's the same basic pattern, a threshold between abundance and restraint, a carnival before a fast, a celebration before a season of reflection. But everywhere, this pattern is expressed through local ingredients, local music, local cultural values, local histories. A Brazilian samba school's parade and an Ethiopian Orthodox monk's fast seem to have nothing in common, except that they're both ways of marking this same ancient threshold, this same transition from one season to another, this same journey toward Easter. This diversity raises an important question. Is there still a coherent tradition of Lent and Shrove Tuesday, or has it fractured into countless separate traditions that merely share a name and a date? Is Rio's Carnival the same phenomenon as a quiet Ash Wednesday service in rural Iowa? Is Polish Fat Thursday connected in any meaningful way to Filipino Holy Week? The answer, perhaps, is yes and no. These practices have diverged dramatically, become embedded in vastly different cultural contexts, serve different social functions. A tourist partying in New Orleans during Mardi Gras and a devout Catholic in Manila observing strict Lenten fasting might barely recognize each other's practices as related. Yet they are connected by history, by calendar, by the human need for rhythm and meaning, by the questions that Lent poses about desire and discipline, suffering and joy, death and resurrection. The thread runs through all these variations, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but never entirely broken. In our globalized, interconnected world, these different expressions are increasingly aware of each other. A teenager in Tokyo can watch Rio's Carnival on YouTube. A Catholic in Poland can read about Ethiopian fasting practices online. This global awareness creates new possibilities. People borrowing practices from other traditions, adapting them, creating hybrid forms. But it also creates new questions about authenticity, appropriation, and respect. When a secular American gives up something for Lent without any Christian commitment, is that honoring the tradition or trivializing it? When corporations use Mardi Gras imagery to sell products, is that cultural celebration or commercial exploitation? These questions don't have simple answers. What we can say is that Lent and Shrove Tuesday, as we experience them in the 21st century, are simultaneously ancient and constantly new, universal and endlessly local, sacred and secular, traditional and innovative. They are, in short, fully human traditions, messy, contradictory, beautiful, and evolving. As we near the end of our journey through history, it's time to ask perhaps the most important question of all. What do Lent and Shrove Tuesday mean today? And perhaps more critically, what will they mean tomorrow? To answer this, we need to understand that these traditions now exist in a uniquely complex cultural moment. We live in an age of unprecedented abundance for some and desperate scarcity for others. We live with technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors, yet we face existential threats, climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics that they never imagined. We live in societies more diverse, more connected, and more fractured than perhaps any in human history. In this context, the ancient rhythms of Lent and Shrove Tuesday function in surprising ways. For many religious believers, particularly Catholics and some Protestants, Lent remains primarily what it has always been: a spiritual discipline, a time of preparation for Easter, a season of prayer and self-examination. These practitioners might give up certain foods or habits, attend extra services, engage in charitable works, read devotional literature. For them, Lent isn't primarily about history or culture. It's about their personal relationship with God, their community of faith, their journey toward Easter's resurrection. But even within this traditional religious context, meanings are shifting. There's growing emphasis on what some call eco-Lent, using the season to focus on environmental stewardship. Catholic bishops and Protestant leaders issue Lenten messages about creation care, about reducing consumption, about living more sustainably. The disciplines of Lent, eating less meat, consuming less, practicing simplicity, align remarkably well with environmental concerns. Some churches organize carbon fasts, calculating the carbon footprint of various activities and encouraging members to reduce emissions during Lent. Others focus on water usage, single-use plastics, or food waste. Lent becomes a laboratory for sustainable living, a 40-day experiment in whether we can actually change our habits, reduce our impact, live differently. This environmental framing gives Lent new urgency. It's no longer just about personal piety or even social justice in a conventional sense. It's about the survival of life on Earth, about our responsibility to future generations, about whether humanity can exercise the self-restraint necessary to avoid catastrophe. The stakes in this reading couldn't be higher. Other believers emphasize social justice dimensions. Lent becomes a time to confront racism, economic inequality, or other systemic injustices. Some churches organize privilege fasts, asking members to become aware of their advantages and work to dismantle unfair systems. Others focus on immigration, asking, what would it mean to welcome the stranger during Lent? Still others emphasize criminal justice reform, asking members to visit prisoners, advocate for policy changes, or examine their own complicity in mass incarceration. These social justice approaches to Lent sometimes create tension with more traditional emphases. Is Lent primarily about personal holiness or systemic change? About individual transformation or collective action? The debates can be fierce, reflecting larger disagreements about the nature and purpose of Christianity itself. But there's also a huge population for whom Lent exists in a completely different register, as cultural heritage, family tradition, or simply a pleasant custom, largely divorced from religious content. In the United Kingdom, Pancake Day has become almost entirely secularized for many people. Families make pancakes because that's what you do on Shrove Tuesday, because it's fun, because it's tradition. The religious context might be vaguely known, something about Easter being 40 days away, but it's not the point. The point is the pancakes themselves, the family gathering, the shared ritual. Is this a loss? Some religious leaders lament what they see as the hollowing out of sacred traditions, their reduction to mere cultural customs. But others see value even in secularized observance. The rituals still create community, still mark time, still connect people to something larger than themselves. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's still meaningful. Shrove Tuesday pancakes in a secular British household and Lent observed by a devout Catholic nun in a monastery are different phenomena, certainly. But perhaps they're both valid responses to the same deep human needs, for rhythm, for ritual, for connection, for meaning. The rise of individualized, personalized Lent is another striking contemporary development. People craft their own Lenten practices, mixing traditional elements with contemporary concerns. Someone might give up social media, very modern, while praying the Stations of the Cross, very traditional. Another might fast from negative self-talk while volunteering at a homeless shelter. The combinations are endless and highly personal. This individualization reflects broader cultural trends toward customization and personal choice. But it also raises questions. If everyone observes Lent differently, is there still a shared Lent experience? Does the diversity enrich the tradition or fragment it beyond recognition? Technology has created entirely new ways of observing Lent. Apps track your progress on Lenten commitments. Online communities provide support and accountability. Virtual pilgrimages let you walk ancient routes from your treadmill. Podcasts offer daily Lenten meditations during your commute. Some of this enhances traditional practice. Some fundamentally transforms it. Consider the question of fasting from technology itself. Increasingly popular as a Lenten discipline, people give up social media, smartphones, television, or the internet entirely. There's deep irony here. Using the ancient practice of Lent to address problems that didn't exist until the 21st century. But there's also continuity, the same basic impulse to step back from things that dominate our attention, to create space for reflection and relationship. Young people, particularly, are reinventing Lent in creative ways. Some observe Lent for the earth, focusing exclusively on environmental practices. Others do random acts of kindness Lent, performing one kind act daily. Still others engage in Justice Lent, using the 40 days to learn about and act on social justice issues. These adaptations sometimes look nothing like traditional Lent, but they capture something essential: the idea that there should be seasons of life dedicated to growth, change, and intentional living. The form changes radically, but the underlying pattern persists. What about Shrove Tuesday and Carnival? Here too, we see remarkable diversity. Rio's Carnival continues to grow, becoming ever more spectacular. New Orleans' Mardi Gras has rebounded from Hurricane Katrina and the pandemic, proving remarkably resilient. Smaller carnival celebrations pop up in unexpected places, from small-town America to cities in Asia, as people seek the joy, release, and communal celebration that Carnival provides. But Carnival also faces challenges. Concerns about public safety, environmental impact, and commercial exploitation are growing. Some question whether celebrations that generate mountains of plastic waste and encourage overconsumption can continue in their current forms. Cities grapple with how to maintain carnival traditions while addressing these concerns. There's also ongoing debate about Carnival's meaning. Is it still a pre-Lenten celebration, or has it become something else entirely? A tourist attraction, a cultural festival, an economic engine disconnected from religious context? Can it be multiple things simultaneously? Should we worry about the loss of original meaning, or celebrate the evolution of living traditions? Looking forward, what might Lent and Shrove Tuesday become? Climate change will almost certainly affect these traditions. As seasons become less predictable, as traditional agricultural cycles shift, the timing and meaning of spring festivals may change. Lent's late winter/early spring position made sense in a world where this was the hungry season, but climate disruption is changing everything. We might see more regional variations in how and when these traditions are observed. We might see new meanings emerge as people adapt ancient practices to new realities. Or we might see certain aspects fade away as their original context disappear entirely. Technological change will continue to reshape observance. Virtual reality might create new forms of pilgrimage or meditation. Artificial intelligence might offer personalized spiritual guidance. Genetic engineering and life extension technologies might challenge Lent's emphasis on mortality and the body's limitations. How do you remember you are dust if humans begin living for centuries? Growing religious diversity and secularization will likely continue. In many societies, Christianity will become one option among many, or no option at all. What happens to Lent and Shrove Tuesday in a world where Christianity is no longer culturally dominant? Do they become purely historical curiosities, museum pieces, or do they transform into something new? Secular seasons of reflection, cultural festivals celebrating heritage, opportunities for communities to gather regardless of religious belief. There's precedent for this. Many traditional religious holidays have successfully transitioned to primarily cultural observances. Could Lent do the same? Some scholars and religious leaders worry about this possibility, seeing it as a loss. Others embrace it, arguing that these traditions serve important human needs that transcend any particular religious framework. The rhythm of feast and fast, celebration and reflection, abundance and restraint. Perhaps these are universally human patterns that will persist in some form regardless of religious content. What seems certain is that Lent and Shrove Tuesday will continue to evolve. They have survived nearly 2,000 years of radical change. The fall of empires, the splitting of churches, scientific and industrial revolutions, wars and plagues, and social upheavals. They have proven remarkably adaptable, capable of meaning different things in different times and places while maintaining some essential continuity. As we stand in the present, looking toward an uncertain future, these ancient traditions offer both wisdom and questions. They remind us that humans have always needed rhythms, seasons, structured time for reflection and renewal. They show us that celebration and restraint, feast and fast, are not opposites but partners in a dance. They teach us that meaning often comes through participation in something larger than ourselves, through connection to communities past and present. Whether observed religiously or culturally, collectively or individually, Lent and Shrove Tuesday continue to serve as thresholds, moments when we pause, reflect, and prepare for what comes next. In a world of constant acceleration and change, perhaps we need such thresholds more than ever. We've traveled through nearly 2,000 years of history, across continents and cultures, through wars and revolutions, plagues and celebrations. We've watched Lent and Shrove Tuesday transform from early Christian practices into a global kaleidoscope of traditions. Now, as we conclude our journey, it's worth stepping back to ask, what does this long, complex history reveal about us? About who we are as human beings, about what we need, about how we make meaning in the world. At the most fundamental level, the story of Lent and Shrove Tuesday is a story about time, about how humans structure and experience the passage of days and seasons. We don't simply live through time. We mark it, measure it, give it shape and significance. We create calendars, not just to track dates, but to create meaning, to turn the endless flow of moments into a meaningful pattern. Our ancestors understood something crucial. Time without rhythm becomes oppressive. Days that all feel the same eventually feel meaningless. We need variation, alternation, seasons of different character and purpose. We need times of celebration and times of restraint, periods of abundance and periods of simplicity, moments of wild joy and moments of quiet reflection. Lent and Shrove Tuesday, in their classical form, created precisely this kind of rhythm. They acknowledge that human beings are complex creatures who need both indulgence and discipline, both release and structure. The feast made the fast bearable. The fast made the feast meaningful. Each gave context and purpose to the other. This wisdom feels particularly relevant in our contemporary moment. We live in a culture of perpetual availability, constant consumption, endless options. Everything is accessible all the time: entertainment, food, information, connection. In such a world, the idea of voluntary limitation, of chosen scarcity, of saying not now or not this, becomes radical. When everything is permitted and available, nothing feels special. When every day can include rich foods and entertainment and stimulation, these things lose their power to delight. The Lenten pattern suggests an alternative. That meaning comes through contrast, that pleasure is heightened by its absence, that we appreciate most what we sometimes do without. But the history we've explored also reveals the dangers and limitations of this pattern. Medieval Lent was often harsh, sometimes cruel, occasionally used to control and shame rather than to liberate and renew. The line between healthy discipline and harmful deprivation isn't always clear. Fasting can be spiritual practice or eating disorder. Self-denial can be growth-producing or self-destructive. Contemporary practitioners of Lent grapple with these questions constantly. How do you practice meaningful restraint without falling into unhealthy patterns? How do you distinguish between growth-producing discomfort and harmful self-punishment? There are no simple answers, and the history shows us that every era has struggled with these boundaries. The story of Shrove Tuesday and Carnival reveals something else essential about human nature: our need for transgression, for moments when normal rules don't apply, when we can be something other than our everyday selves. The masked balls of Venice, the street parties of Rio, the pancake races of England, all these in different ways create temporary spaces where ordinary constraints are lifted. Anthropologists and psychologists have long recognized that societies need these safety valves, these authorized moments of rule-breaking. Without them, social order becomes brittle, resentments build, pressure accumulates with no healthy outlet. Carnival, at its best, provides that outlet, controlled chaos that ultimately reinforces rather than destroys social bonds. But Carnival can also be dangerous, exploitative, or empty. The line between liberation and license, between celebration and destruction, is always precarious. Throughout history, authorities have worried about Carnival getting out of hand, and sometimes those worries were justified. The same traditions that could foster community could also enable violence, harassment, and harm. What's striking, looking across the history, is how the specific content of these traditions matters less than their structural function. Whether you make pancakes or pack ski, whether you parade through streets or attend quiet church services, what matters is that you're participating in something communal, something that connects you to others and to the past, something that marks time and creates meaning. This suggests that what humans need isn't any particular tradition, but the experience of tradition itself, the sense of participating in practices larger and older than ourselves, the connection to community and continuity. We need ritual, rhythm, shared observance. The specific forms can vary infinitely. The underlying need remains constant. The globalization of Lent and Shrove Tuesday, their transformation as they spread across the world, offers profound lessons about cultural exchange, adaptation, and creativity. When Spanish missionaries brought Lent to Latin America, they couldn't simply impose their practices unchanged. The traditions had to take root in local soil, incorporate local ingredients, speak to local experiences. What emerged was neither purely Spanish nor purely indigenous, but something new and vital. This process of cultural mixing, syncretism, is sometimes viewed with suspicion by purists who worry about corruption of original forms. But the history suggests that traditions have always been hybrid, always borrowed and adapted, always mixed elements from different sources. The pure tradition is usually a myth. Depth and richness come from complexity and mixture. This has important implications for how we think about tradition in our multicultural, globalized world. Rather than preserving practices in pristine isolation, perhaps we should celebrate creative adaptation, encourage respectful borrowing, welcome the new forms that emerge when traditions meet and merge. The Ethiopian Christian fast and the Brazilian Catholic Carnival are both authentic expressions of these traditions, despite being vastly different from their Mediterranean origins. The persistence of these traditions, despite massive social change, is itself remarkable and revealing. Lent and Shrove Tuesday have survived the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, industrialization, 2 world wars, the sexual revolution, the digital age. They've been attacked by religious reformers, dismissed by rationalists, undermined by consumer culture. Yet they persist. Why? Partly inertia and habit, certainly. Partly institutional support from churches that maintain these observances. But partly, surely, because they meet genuine needs that don't disappear just because circumstances change. The need for rhythm, for community, for structured time, for rituals that mark life's passages. These are deeply human needs that transcend particular historical moments. Yet persistence doesn't mean unchanging. One of the most important lessons from this history is that living traditions must evolve or die. The Lent observed today is not the Lent of the 4th century or the 14th century or even the 20th century. It has changed continuously, adapting to new circumstances, taking on new meanings, serving new purposes. This evolution isn't betrayal of tradition, it is the tradition. The essence of a living tradition is precisely its capacity to change while maintaining continuity, to adapt while preserving identity. Dead traditions are frozen in amber, museum pieces. Living traditions breathe, grow, sometimes sicken, sometimes flourish, but always change. What makes a tradition authentic, then, isn't its unchanging preservation of original forms, but its organic connection to living communities who find meaning in it. Brazilian Carnival is authentic not because it perfectly replicates medieval European Carnival. It doesn't, but because it genuinely expresses Brazilian culture and speaks to Brazilian experiences. As we contemplate the future of Lent and Shrove Tuesday, this understanding of living tradition is crucial. These practices will certainly continue to evolve. They may look quite different in 50 or 100 years. Some current forms may disappear. New forms will emerge. The question isn't whether they'll change. They will, but whether they'll remain meaningful to living communities. There's something profound in the image of humans, across centuries and continents, gathering each year to make pancakes, to receive ashes, to parade through streets, to fast and pray and celebrate. The specific reasons shift: preparation for baptism, penitential discipline, using up forbidden foods, cultural celebration, environmental witness, social justice. But the gathering continues. In that continuity, we see something essential about human nature. We are temporal beings who need to mark time, social beings who need shared rituals, meaning-making beings who need practices that connect us to something larger than our individual selves. We are also, the history suggests, creatures capable of remarkable creativity and adaptation. We take old forms and make them new. We find ancient wisdom and apply it to contemporary problems. We honor tradition while innovating boldly. This capacity for creative continuity may be one of our species' greatest gifts. As our story draws to a close, we're left not with answers, but with appreciation for the complexity of human culture, for the persistence of human hope, for the endless human capacity to create meaning through ritual and tradition. Every year, as winter yields to spring, as the carnival music fades and the Lenten quiet descends, as pancakes are made and ashes are received, humans around the world participate in something ancient, and something new, something personal and something universal, something sacred and something profoundly, beautifully human. The story continues. The traditions evolve, the threshold beckons, and we, like countless generations before us and countless generations yet to come, stand at the crossing, honoring the past, embracing the present, preparing for what comes next. This is the gift of Lent and Shrove Tuesday. Not unchanging certainty, but living connection. Not rigid rules, but flexible wisdom. Not escape from time, but meaningful participation in its passage. The history is long, but the pattern is simple. Feast and fast, celebration and reflection, abundance and restraint, death and resurrection, winter and spring, darkness and light. This is our story. This is who we are. And the story, beautifully, endlessly, hopefully, continues. This concludes our journey through the history of Lent and Shrove Tuesday. Thank you for listening, and be sure and subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thanks again, and have a good night.